Over on Jaguar Gatorade, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about the time that Washington tried to sue Florida State over a football game. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. Sometimes, playoff scenarios are pretty straightforward. Sometimes, it's just a matter of if you win the game, you're in, and if you lose the game, you're out. But other times, it's not that cut and dry. Other times, you've got scenarios with a few more variables in there, where you need the help of another team to get into the mix, and you don't control your own destiny. Sure, it takes a bit of time to figure out, and might take more than just a few seconds to think about how the calculations work. But eventually, you figure it out in the end, whether that be through reading articles, going over the tiebreakers and just going right down the line, or whether that is asking someone who knows the situation. In other words, no matter how complicated it is, 99% of the time, teams around the league know exactly what has to happen in order to get into the playoffs, clinch the division, get home field advantage, or anything else along those lines. And then, there's this team right here that you've been watching this whole time. The 1990 Cincinnati Bengals, who had no idea what they needed. And then again, neither did anyone else. Because for some reason, trying to figure out the Bengals playoff scenarios in 1990 was like trying to figure out why kids love the taste of Cinnamon Toast Crunch, or how many licks it takes to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop. No one knows the answer, yet everyone wonders the question. The players didn't know, the coaches didn't know, officials didn't know. Entering the final week of the season, quite literally, no one who should have known the answer to this question knew what the Bengals had to do in order to make it into the playoffs. As for how the scenario was eventually figured out, well, let's just say it's an unexpected ending if you know anything about this coach's history. Because even if it might not seem like it, this is the story behind what has to be, considering the circumstances, the most confusing playoff scenario in NFL history. Before I talk about the actual scenario in question, and the confusion that came with it, we need some context to understand the team in question, and how they were playing, because it will give us an idea of what was on the line. The year is 1990, and after a disappointing 1989 season, where the Bengals missed the playoffs and finished last in the AFC Central, despite having the 4th best offense in football, the 7th best defense in football, and the 2nd best point differential in the conference, the Bengals are looking to make it back to the playoffs for the 2nd time in the last 3 seasons under head coach Sam Wyche. And through the first 15 weeks of the season, which was the first 14 games since this 1990 season, was the first season in the post-merger era where teams had designated bye weeks, things were looking pretty shaky. Following a 3-0 start, where admittedly, they beat up on 3 of the worst teams in football from the year before in the Jets, Chargers, and Patriots, things quickly fell apart as they slid to a 7-7 record, with losses in 5 of their most recent 7 games before this Week 16 battle against their division rival, the Houston Oilers. The good news for Cincinnati was that their final 2 games of the season were on their home turf, so they got a chance to defend their home field and take control there. The bad news was that they were in do-or-die mode. If they lost to the Oilers, then at 7-8, you could pretty much kiss their season goodbye. Fortunately for the Bengals, the Oilers were no problem, as even though the Oilers convincingly won the first meeting down at the Astrodome back in Week 6 by a final score of 48-17, the Bengals got their revenge here and won 40-20, with the Bengals, after trailing 20-13 at one point in the second half, scoring the final 27 points of the game, thanks in part to a great game by running back James Brooks, who had 201 rushing yards and over 10 yards per carry, completely decimating Houston's front 7 and their entire defense all day long. And just like that, the Bengals at 8-7 were right back in the thick of things when it came to the playoff picture. They still needed a bit of help, and they needed some things to go their way, but it wasn't anything out of the realm of possibility. As long as 2 or 3 things happened, they'd be going back to the playoffs and would be playing some January football. Here's what had to happen for the 8-7 Bengals to survive in Week 17 and make it to the playoffs. Number 1, and this should go without saying, but at 1 o'clock on Sunday, December 30th, they had to beat the Cleveland Browns. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Fortunately, the Browns were a terrible team in 1990, and were a shell of what they once were in the late 80s. They were on an interim head coach, and you can learn more about that disaster of a change by clicking the card in the upper right corner. They were 3-12 and had lost 9 of their last 10 games. They had the second worst record, the second worst point differential, and the worst defense in the NFL. And when the two teams met on Monday Night Football back in Week 7, which is the game you've been watching this whole time, the Bengals won it convincingly, taking it 34-13 on Cleveland's home field in front of a national television audience. So in theory, this shouldn't be a problem. No, it's never great to need a win on the final week of the season just to have a shot, but if you're gonna play any team, and it can't be the Patriots, you might as well have it be the Browns. From there, things get a bit dicey, because the Bengals had two very different options to make it into the playoffs. They could have made it as a wild card, or they could have made it as a division winner. Entering the final week of the season, in the newly expanded field, where 6 teams in each conference now made it into the postseason, there were 4 playoff spots clinched: the Buffalo Bills, the Miami Dolphins, the Los Angeles Raiders, and the Kansas City Chiefs, with all 4 teams having at least 10 wins by this point. And this meant that there were 2 spots open: the AFC Central title for the number 3 seed, and 1 final wildcard spot for the number 6 seed. Here are the standings, with the top 4 teams having already clinched, and the other 4 teams still having a shot. Let's start with the wildcard round. At 4 o'clock, the Seattle Seahawks played the Detroit Lions. If the Seahawks lost the game, then the Bengals would be guaranteed to clinch a playoff spot. Why is that the case? Well, the Pittsburgh Steelers and Houston Oilers played each other on Sunday Night Football to close out the final Sunday of the season. If the Bengals won and were 9-7, and the Seahawks lost and were 8-8, then the Seahawks would be eliminated, and it'd just be the 3 AFC Central teams and the Bengals, Oilers, and Steelers fighting for 2 spots. And regardless of what happened in that Steelers-Oilers game, the Bengals would be in by virtue of tiebreakers. If the Steelers beat the Oilers, then the Steelers would be 10-6, the Bengals would be 9-7, and the Oilers would be 8-8. So by default, the Bengals get in as the only 9-7 team in the AFC. However, if the Oilers beat the Steelers, then all 3 of those teams would be 9-7. And before determining a wildcard spot, since these 3 teams have the same record, we need to determine a division champion. In that case, it's Cincinnati, since they have the better divisional record at 5-1 compared to the 4-2 Oilers and the 2-4 Steelers. However, if the Seahawks won the game, then the Bengals could not clinch a wild card, regardless of what happened in the Steelers-Oilers game. If the Steelers won the game, then the Steelers would win the AFC Central with a 10-6 record, the Oilers would be 8-8, and both the Bengals and Seahawks would be 9-7. And this meant that the first tiebreaker in a 2-way tie, which is always head-to-head, applies. Which is not good for the Bengals, because in Week 4, on Monday Night Football, the Seahawks won 31-16. This means that Seattle would be in the playoffs as the number 6 seed. And if the Oilers won the game, then you're in the same boat as before, where you've got 3 9-7 teams in the AFC Central, and you need to break the tie through the 3-way tiebreaker system, which would still favor the Bengals with their 5-1 divisional record. I know it sounds like a lot, but it can basically be boiled down to this. Cincinnati has to win. If they win and Houston wins, then the Bengals win the division. If they win and Pittsburgh wins, then it comes down to whatever happens in the Seattle-Detroit game. If Detroit wins that game, then the Bengals are the number 6 seed. If Seattle wins that game, then the Bengals are out. If the Oilers beat the Steelers, the Seahawks-Lions game means absolutely nothing. Here's a nice, easy, simple to understand chart showcasing the 8 possible combinations that can happen that impact the Bengals, with red meaning that they would be eliminated, yellow meaning that they would get in as a wild card, and green meaning that they would win the division. In other words, the Bengals-Browns game is to stay alive, and if they win that, the Steelers-Oilers game is to determine the division, and the Seahawks-Lions game is to give them an opportunity as a wild card if Steelers-Oilers doesn't exactly bounce their way. And honestly, even though I said a lot, I didn't use any complex tie-breaking systems. There were only 8 combinations, and everything seemed pretty straightforward enough. Even though it might seem a bit weird on the surface, this seems like a massive exaggeration to call this the most confusing playoff scenario of all time, right? I mean, we've seen tons of scenarios similar to this, or even worse than this. We've seen scenarios like the 1997 AFC Central tiebreak that went down to the 5th tiebreaker a point differential in divisional games, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Heck, we've seen scenarios like the 2006 Green Bay Packers that came down to strength of victory, where it truly was complex as to what permutations were necessary to get the Packers in, and what teams had to win their games, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. A somewhat complicated, but in the end, fairly easy to understand 3-team system. Doesn't seem like the most confusing tiebreaker ever. Well, here's the crazy part. Literally no one could figure this out. Seriously. For some reason that I don't know why, it seemed like no one around the league knew what the situation was. When the Browns were holding their press conferences in preparation for their final game of the season against their in-state rival, the Bengals, Browns head coach Jim Schaffner had no idea what the Bengals needed to do in order to make it. As he said, "I've kind of lost track of exactly what has to happen as far as Cincinnati is concerned." He then asked a question to the reporters, saying, "I think if they win, they're in. Is that correct?" Spoiler alert, it's not correct, as we just went over. They don't control their own destiny. And Browns tight end Ozzie Newsome, when told about the Bengals needing to win this game to have a shot at making the playoffs, seemed super confused, saying, "We didn't realize that. We have not been told that. They have to beat us to have a shot?" But okay, hear you saying, those are members on the Browns who don't know what the Bengals have to do. Why would they care? Why would they know? Their season is done. This doesn't involve their team. They don't have to concern themselves with permutations or anything like that. Their job is to just go out there and play football and try to win a game. It's like if you asked a random Titans fan on the street right now what the Titans had to do to make the playoffs, they say that they would have to beat Jacksonville in Week 18. But if you ask that same fan off the top of their head to name what the Patriots had to do to make the playoffs, they probably would not be able to recall it. Except here's the crazier part. Not even Sam Wyche, the head coach of the Bengals, knew what the Bengals had to do in order to make the playoffs. He was just as confused as everyone else. You think that the head coach of the Bengals and the man in charge would know the situation, but apparently not, because he just about devoted his entire press conference leading up to the game not answering questions from reporters, but rather asking questions to reporters, doing a little bit of role reversal, and trying to figure out what the heck was going on. Keep in mind, the great irony in this is that Wyche did not exactly have the greatest and friendliest relationship with reporters, especially in 1990. He had been fined twice before, including after a game against the Seattle Seahawks in 1989, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, for disrespecting the media, for violating the league's media policy, and for keeping the media out of the locker room. 2 months before this incident, he infamously banned women reporters from entering the locker room, saying, "I will not allow women to walk in on 50 naked men. It's not fair to you to know that you can walk out of a shower naked, and your wife can't come in. That's our society. We don't take showers together. We don't walk around naked together. I don't think it's decent. I don't think it's right. You've got 50-odd naked men coming in and out of the shower. You would be offended if I stood here naked now." Keep in mind, these are reporters just trying to do their job. And unsurprisingly, especially in the wake of the incident earlier in the season involving Lisa Olson and the New England Patriots, Wyche was fined over $27,000 for those comments. And now, here he was, so confused, just like the rest of the country and the football world, about this scenario, that he was asking the reporters for help. I know I've wronged you badly in the past, and I know that I'm probably the worst coach in the league to deal with when it comes to complying with the rules and making your life easier. But can you do me a solid and help me out here? Like, that is an amazing irony about this situation, that Sam Wyche, of all people, is asking reporters for help. However, he asked the reporters, I'm not sure. Maybe some of you have looked into it. Is it true that Houston, regardless of what happens in the previous games, still has a chance to get in? Fortunately, for his sake, the reporters did not sabotage him, and they said yes. To which Wyche replied, I didn't realize that. I'm sorry, what? You didn't realize that? That's literally the most important piece of the equation, other than you beating the Browns. You need that result to go Houston's way if you want to have any chance at winning the division, and quite possibly making the playoffs. And you didn't know the deal? Seriously, does anybody around the league have any idea as to how the Bengals make the playoffs? Anyone? Why is trying to figure this out like trying to figure out a complex derivative in calculus? It's 8 combinations, or really 4, since all 4 combos involving the Bengals losing to the Browns automatically mean that the Bengals are eliminated, so you don't even have to worry about those. Why is this so hard? Why is everyone so confused? Anyways, mass confusion aside, now everyone knew the situation. And fortunately for the Bengals and for Sam Wyche, they were able to make it into the playoffs. At 1 o'clock, they took care of business against the Cleveland Browns by defeating them by a final score of 21-14, in a game that was much closer than expected. The Bengals were 16-point favorites, and the game was tied at 14 apiece entering the fourth quarter. However, thanks to a 2-touchdown performance by Boomer Esiason, and a great game by Cincinnati's defense, especially against the pass, where Browns quarterback Mike Pagel went just 14 for 32, completing 43% of his passes, while throwing 3 interceptions, including a pick 6, and posting a passer rating of 33.9, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. The Bengals got the all-important win, even if it was a bit ugly. The bad news was that at 4 o'clock, the Seahawks, quite easily, took care of business against the Lions, winning 30-10, scoring the final 23 points of the game, and eliminating Cincinnati's wildcard chances and taking away that lifeline. However, because the Oilers destroyed the Steelers 34-14 on Sunday Night Football, in a game that wasn't even that close, seeing as the Oilers led it 24-0 at the half, which was a 4-possession contest back then, the Bengals won the AFC Central. So in the end, everything worked itself out for the Bengals. But it is truly baffling how this playoff scenario caused so much confusion for so many people, because it seemed like no one knew what the deal was. Throughout the history of the NFL, there have been a ton of playoff scenarios that have been calculated. There were some that were way more complex than this. There were some that featured way more options than this. There were some that featured way wackier stuff than this. And there were some that featured tiebreakers that were way, way lower than this. But considering the circumstances, and considering how much this one of all things threw people for a loop, there have never been any playoff scenarios as confusing as this one involving the 1990 Cincinnati Bengals. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.